We've had a chance recently to retest several of MSI's popular QD-OLED gaming monitors, and we've taken a look at the very latest firmware updates that they've released over the last couple of months. This includes the 32-inch MPG321 URX with a 4K 240Hz panel, which we originally reviewed back in February 2024. We had a look at their version 10 firmware in June this year, and now we're going to have a look at the latest improvements made in their version 11 firmware. Then there's the 27-inch MPG271 QRX with a 1440p 360Hz panel. We originally reviewed that in March and also looked at their version 10 firmware in June again. This model also has a newer version 11 firmware as well, with a few improvements which we'll look at today. Finally, there's the 34-inch ultra-wide MAG341CQP. This is their original 175Hz refresh rate model that we reviewed in April 2024. There's been a bunch of updates in a new version 25 firmware released recently in September, so we'll take a look at that one too. Their other 34-inch ultra-wide model, the MPG341CQPX, with a 240Hz refresh rate, has also received a new version 20 firmware update in September as well, which includes a load of new updates, but our original review was already based on that firmware as we had advanced access to it at the time. So everything in our original review for that model is still relevant and up to date in terms of firmware. There's links to our reviews of all four of these screens in the description below, so let us know in the comments section if you own any of these screens and how you're finding them. It's great to see continued focus from MSI on improvements, bug fixes and updates to their OLED monitors, and we know there's lots of owners out there and potential buyers who will be interested in the latest performance results. So let's get right into it. It's actually dead easy to update the firmware, but you're going to need to install MSI's Gaming Intelligence software, which is a hefty 500 meg file download. So that's going to take a little bit of time. You also need to connect your display back to your PC using the provided USB-A to USB-B cable so that the two can then communicate with one another, and the software will then tell you once it's connected and ready to go. You can check which firmware version you currently have installed on the screen in the bottom right hand corner of the menu. You can then download the latest firmware from MSI support pages. We've provided links to those in the description below. The firmware files themselves are under 1 meg in size, so they're quick and easy to download. Download the firmware file and unzip it somewhere on your desktop. To install the firmware, you have to go into the Gaming Intelligence software, press the little gear icon at the top right, then you need to select the scaler button in the firmware update section. Take note of the warnings and then hit next to proceed. You can select your file from there and then just press update and it will do its thing. The actual update takes around 9 minutes in total, and at the end you're asked to unplug and replug the AC power cable from the monitor. Afterwards you should see the new firmware listed in the bottom right of the on-screen menu, and you're all done. Before we get into the new testing, we wanted to provide an update on a common question that we've had recently, and that relates to the HDR modes on MSI screens and the darker than intended Peak 1000 mode. If you're unfamiliar with this issue, check out our article that's linked below where we examine Peak 1000 and the True Black 400 modes on various QD-OLED monitors. MSI told us recently that they're investing a lot of time and effort in seeing how best they can improve this, and it's definitely still being worked on. The update isn't quite ready yet, but it is reassuring to know that they are looking into it. When we get an update on the performance in HDR, we'll let you know. On to the testing then of the latest firmware, and let's start with the 32-inch and 27-inch models, which both have the same list of updates with their new version 11 firmware. As a reminder, it was the previous version 10 update that we covered in our June update that includes updates like a DSC on-off switch, new aspect ratio modes, a fix so that the color gamut setting is independent between SDR and HDR modes, improved VRR flicker performance, and various other optimization and bug fixes. Those are all included, of course, with the version 11 firmware, so if you're updating from something even older, you only need to install this latest version. The most interesting update with version 11 firmware is the improvements to input lag that these two screens offer. For the 32-inch model, we measured some small improvements in the lag at the native 240Hz refresh rate, which was already super fast anyway, and now it's made up almost entirely of the super fast pixel response times and basically gives us a zero signal processing lag. It was the 60Hz lag that remained quite high before, and that's been improved massively here, dropping from 13.57 milliseconds in the previous version 10 firmware to only 4.5 milliseconds now. This makes the screen even more suited to external games consoles and devices that might need to operate at 60Hz, and it's great to see this improved. Remember though that it's the 240Hz lag figure that will apply as long as you have set your active Windows refresh rate at 240Hz. Regardless of your achieved frame rates, and that's whether you're using VRR or not. The 60Hz lag figure is only applicable if you're specifically setting 60Hz in Windows, or if you're using an external device which only supports that refresh rate. For the 27-inch model, it's a very similar story, with basically zero signal processing lag at the native 360Hz refresh rate, and significant improvements at 60Hz, now down to 4.7 milliseconds lag. Also of particular note in the version 11 firmware updates for these models is the optimization of the OLED care settings. On the old firmware, these features were all disabled by default, with the exception of the screen shift function, which you can't turn off anyway. On the new firmware, these are all enabled by default now for better image retention and burn-in mitigation. Each of them is set to the lower setting, but you can further tweak these if you want. This should ensure that users are optimized out of the box for image retention mitigation and burn-in protection. The new firmware for the 27-inch and 32-inch models also includes a fix for allowing you to enable HDR mode even when DSC has been turned off in the menu. We actually didn't find that to be an issue on the previous version 10 firmware when we tested it, but we assume that some people are finding this problematic, and so that's been updated here. Let's have a look at the 34-inch ultra-wide models as well. MSI have recently released a version 20 firmware on the 2nd of September for their 240Hz MPG 341CQP-X model. We actually had access to that for our original review. There's loads of changes that they've added to that screen that will be useful to any existing owners, including a DSC on-off switch, new aspect ratio modes, improvements to input lag and OLED care features. There's no need for us to retest that screen as we used that already in our original review that's linked below. But here's the input lag performance from that model using this firmware for completeness. We are, however, going to retest their other 34-inch ultra-wide model today, the MAG341CQP, which is their 175Hz refresh rate model. We tested that back in July this year on the original firmware, which was version 17 at the time. The newer firmware, released on the 2nd of September as well, is now version 25, although there haven't actually been any others between the original and this one. So we can only assume that it's gone through various iterations internally at MSI before finally being released as version 25. Let's take a look at this larger set of updates provided on the MAG model. Most interesting again are the input lag improvements made with the new firmware. The performance at 175Hz was basically zero before anyway, but there's been a big improvement for fixed 60Hz inputs like on the other models, dropping from 15.5 milliseconds to 6.3 milliseconds lag. Remember again, this figure only applies for fixed 60Hz refresh rate input devices. It's the lower lag that applies for any PC gaming and VRR situation, regardless of your frame rate, as long as you set Windows refresh rate to 175Hz. Like on the 27-inch and 32-inch MPG models, the OLED care settings have also been updated here to be turned on by default to help with that image retention mitigation. MSI have also added specific aspect ratio modes on this model for 24.5-inch and 27-inch size screens, which might be handy if you want to simulate specific screen sizes for gaming. Like on their other screens, which received this update back in May, there's now an option on the screen menu to turn off the power light if you want, useful to those who might want to game in a dark room and avoid distractions. There's also been some more minor updates, bug fixes and optimizations like different language options, fixing the aspect ratio for the picture-in-picture mode, optimizing the EDID timing of the HDMI 2.1 modes to support consoles, and changing the naming convention for the VRR setting in the screen menu to say FreeSync Premium Pro instead of Adapter Sync. That's been done now that the screen has been certified under AMD's scheme. One other change reported that was supposed to be fixed was a fix for the issue where the preset mode was not being remembered independently between SDR and HDR modes, meaning that if you were using sRGB mode, for instance, for SDR, as many people probably would, when you switched to HDR mode, that sRGB preset remained active, which you don't want for HDR content. MSI fixed this on their other models in their update back in May, and it's supposed to be fixed here on the MAG341CQP as well, according to the firmware changelog. But we found that actually the same preset modes seemed to stick between SDR and HDR modes, and it was not possible to set this independently still. We've reached back out to MSI with that finding and to get further feedback, but we're sure this will be fixed pretty quickly with a further firmware update. Keep an eye on their support page for this screen for another new firmware update to address this remaining bug. So there you go, there's a lot of new features, updates and fixes in the new firmware, and well done for MSI again for listening to their users and making lots of great updates available since these screens were released. It was nice to see the MAG341 CQP receive a load of the updates already released early in the year for the 27-inch and 32-inch MPG models too. As we said at the start, one remaining issue is the EOTF tracking and brightness in the HDR Peak 1000 mode that we have investigated in detail recently, and we flagged that back to MSI already. To recap, they tell us that they're looking into this and are spending a lot of time and effort to get this working as optimally as possible. So hopefully there may be another firmware update at some point soon for that too. We've got reviews of all 4 of the models covered in this update linked below, so check those out if you want to know more. Do hit subscribe if you'd like to stay up to date on future monitor news, reviews and other content. Thank you for watching, and we'll catch you next time.